This black boy had had a strenuous day at work, but when he noticed an old lady walk into the crowded bus, he quickly offered her a seat without giving it too much thought. But then she handed him a shocking note that affected his life. As 23-year-old Marcus got to the bus stop after a day's hard work juggling between being a machine operator and a cleaner in a production factory, he saw the bus and jumped right on it. He was lucky to spot a free seat as the buses were always crowded in the evening. He was exhausted. His whole body ached, and his toxic boss had unloaded his frustration and anger on him as usual. He had been up since 5 a.m. and had hardly had any time to sit down. As he settled into his seat, no one looked or paid him any mind. Everyone was focused on their phones or their own issues. Marcus leaned back and began to think. He knew he could not keep up with such labor for long. He would only burn out. As he was deep in thought, the bus slowed down to pick up a passenger, and an old woman stepped on. She looked so frail, and her steps were unsteady. She moved slowly from the door into the bus, and when she saw that all the seats were occupied, she rested her body on the window pane. She clearly wasn't comfortable, but she had no choice. No one would be kind enough to give her a seat. After all, in this city, everyone looked after no one but themselves. She just wished the bus would be faster so she could get to her destination quickly. As the bus moved, she winced as her waist and knees started aching. Marcus looked up and noticed the old woman's struggle. He felt compassion immediately for her and called out to her, "Hello, ma'am," he said kindly. "You can have my seat." The old woman was shocked at first. She never believed there could be someone in this city who could be so kind and considerate. She smiled at him and limped slowly to his seat. Marcus helped her sit down while he stood for the rest of the journey. 3 minutes later, Marcus reached his bus stop and called to the driver to slow down. As he alighted the bus, the old woman's frail hands grabbed his jacket. He turned to her in surprise, and then he felt her fingers crawl into his pocket. She put a note into the pocket, and there was no time to inquire what the note was about as the other passengers were already pushing him. Marcus stepped off the bus, and immediately it zoomed off. It all felt surreal. Why would she put a note in his pocket? Maybe it was a thank you note, he thought. So Marcus put his hand in his pocket and pulled out the note. What he saw scribbled on the note made his mouth hang open. Written on one side of the note was a street address, and the other part was 5 numbers written like a code. Together, it read, 5, Queen Street, code 88687. This sure was confusing for Marcus. He tried to understand, but it didn't make any sense. What was this? After thinking for some time, he folded the paper up, put it in his pocket, and headed home. He really needed his rest more than anything else. Once home, Marcus took a quick bath and tried to rest. But try as he did, he couldn't bring himself to sleep. He was still thinking about the old woman in the note. It was clearly an address, but could the address be a trap? Somehow, he couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned, thinking about what to do. The next day, Marcus boarded the bus with the hope of seeing the old woman and asking her about the note. But there was no sign of the old woman that morning. He hoped to see her in the evening after work, but there was still no sign of her. Marcus was disappointed, and his confusion deepened as he wondered what message she was trying to convey. He couldn't get the note off his mind, and he spent the next 2 days thinking deeply about it. His curiosity reached its peak, so he made a mental note to visit the address on his day off. His Fridays were always off, and he used them to do his laundry, but that Friday, Marcus decided to visit the address and see for himself. He just hoped he wasn't endangering his life by walking right into a trap. He boarded the same bus where he met the old lady and headed to the address. It took 35 minutes before the bus reached the destination. As soon as Marcus got down from the bus, he couldn't find any house around the area. Well, he did, but it was a large, intimidating estate that was surrounded by gardens and trees. The entire vicinity was calm and felt so natural. Marcus looked around, studying the environment for any signs of danger. When he was satisfied that he was safe, he headed towards the large gate. He knocked at the gate, but there was no response. It made sense because there was no gate post, and the house was too far from the gate for anyone to hear him knocking and open it up. Marcus looked at the gate and noticed the panel by the central lock. When he opened it, he saw a small monitor with a keypad. It needed a security code to be put in. Marcus wondered what it could possibly be until it hit him. The security code was the 5-digit number on the note. Marcus pulled out the note and typed the code. He was immediately granted access as the gate opened. He stepped into the large compound and saw that there was a huge mansion nestled at the end of it. He walked towards it, hoping to get to the root of the mystery. When he reached the front door, it was ajar, and he pushed it open. As he stepped into the large living room, he saw something that shocked him to his very core. There sat the very same old woman he met on the bus. She was sitting on a sofa with a bright smile on her face. From the looks of things, it was obvious that she had been expecting him. She looked quite glad that he showed up. Marcus had a lot of questions to ask her. The woman introduced herself as Vivien. Marcus was eager to know why the woman led him there. Firstly, Vivien thanked Marcus for helping her on the bus. She had gone for a medical checkup that day and couldn't get a cab. That's why she had opted to use the public bus. The old lady offered Marcus a drink, but he wasn't interested. He wanted to know why the woman had led him there. Vivien cleared her throat while maintaining an air of suspense. Marcus, on the other hand, felt quite uneasy. He wished the woman would just open up. Vivien finally took a deep breath and said the words she needed a caretaker. She was sick, and at her age, she could barely do stuff around the house. Her health was worsening daily, so she needed someone to take care of her. At almost 70, it was difficult to navigate around such a big house. To show that she was serious, she disclosed the pay. Marcus was shocked. The pay was 6 times that of his former job. That was a dream come true. All of a sudden, Marcus felt his worries fade away. He immediately accepted the job offer, and Vivien was glad. In the past 4 years, she had employed over 7 caretakers. Most of them stole from her while some grew tired of the job and left, but she knew she could trust Marcus, who had proved to be a compassionate soul. Marcus's only request was for a few days to take care of some personal stuff before he took up work. Vivien agreed with that and bid him farewell. Marcus stepped out of the house with mixed feelings. He thought of his new job and the challenges that would come with it. He wondered why an old woman would choose to live in such a big house alone. At the same time, Vivien was a cheerful and kind woman, and he was sure he would enjoy the job. Marcus showed up at the factory and submitted his resignation letter. His boss was shocked at his decision, but when he saw Marcus's mind was made up, he offered to double his pay. For someone who had belittled him and screamed at him for the last few years, Marcus was shocked. It turned out his boss took his anger out on him because he knew Marcus needed the job and would not quit. But he also knew that Marcus was a very hard worker that would be very hard to replace. Marcus had already made up his mind, though, and he politely declined. After 2 days, Marcus started work at Vivien's house. His job wasn't tasking. All he had to do was make Vivien breakfast and ensure she took her medication. He also readied her bathwater, did the laundry, and cleaned around the house. After working for the day, he would grab a drink and watch his favorite show on television. By then, Vivien would be asleep for hours. When she woke up, they would often sit down and talk. Vivien was a storyteller, and she entertained Marcus with tales of the past. Marcus loved to listen to her because of her profound wisdom. They would speak for hours, and then he would make dinner for her. He ensured that everything was in order before he decided he was done for the day. Marcus grew a strong emotional attachment to Vivien, and her home became like his second home. He began to view taking care of Vivien not as his job but as a responsibility. Vivien loved Scotch eggs, and he would make them every morning for her. He did everything else she needed, never complained, and was always polite and kind. As the days passed, Vivien became weaker. She could barely move 10 paces, and her breath quickened so much that it seemed like her heart would fail. Marcus was always there by her side to help her out. He would read newspapers to her, and they watched some operas on television. One early morning, as he stepped into the sitting room with a couple of pastries he had bought for Vivien's surprise, he saw something shocking. Vivien was struggling to breathe, and it was a very scary thing to see. In deep panic, he grabbed the phone and dialed emergency services. After 15 minutes, an ambulance arrived, and they rushed Vivien to the hospital. She was placed on 4 fluids, and the doctors recommended some drugs for her. Marcus was glad that he had come earlier that morning. What a stroke of luck! He was fidgeting as he stood by Vivien's side. He held her hand and prayed for her survival. 20 minutes later, Vivien woke up. She looked up to Marcus and smiled. She thanked him for being there for her. Marcus just claimed that he was doing his job, but he knew it was more than that. Vivien was discharged that evening, and they took a cab home. When they arrived, Marcus prepared scrambled eggs and served her. When she was done with her meal, he led her to her room and watched her snuggle into her thick duvet. It was late, and Vivien bid him good night, but Marcus didn't make plans to leave. The morning incident still traumatized him because he knew if he had come just 20 minutes later, Vivien would have passed on. So he didn't want to leave anything to chance any longer. There were 3 spare bedrooms, and he planned to sleep in one of them. Vivien thanked him again for everything, but reminded him that it was late and he needed to go back home. But Marcus insisted that he would sleep over, so he bid her good night and headed to one of the bedrooms. Little did he know the consequences of this choice. A few minutes after midnight, Marcus was awakened by a strange sound. He got up and checked on Vivien, but the old lady was sleeping soundly. Feeling satisfied, Marcus headed back to his room, but to his surprise, he heard the sound again. This time it sounded like someone was picking a keyhole, but Marcus dismissed the thought. The fence was high enough to deter intruders, and the gate was locked with a password, meaning it wasn't easy to break in. Marcus wasn't worried, so he laid back on the bed and dozed off. A few minutes later, Marcus was awakened by a sharp scream. He jumped off the bed and ran into Vivien's room. There, he saw a truly shocking scene. There was a masked man with a gun pointed at Vivien, demanding her money and jewelry. Marcus's first thought was that Vivien was too fragile to deal with this kind of trauma, and he quickly sprang into action. As someone who had grown up doing monotonous, laborious jobs, his reflexes were sharp and precise. Marcus quickly disarmed the intruder, and the weapon fell to the ground. The intruder was extremely shocked at Marcus's presence, as he knew the old woman stayed alone. He never even saw Marcus until he kicked the weapon out of his hand. He knew he needed to beat Marcus to escape. They engaged in a scuffle, and Marcus didn't give the intruder any breathing space. Marcus was a better fighter, and he knocked the intruder to the floor. But the man wasn't ready to give up. As Vivien dialed 911, the intruder tried to make good on his escape. He pulled out a small knife, and before Marcus could react, he buried the blade into Marcus's stomach and jumped out through the window. The penknife was a small one, but Marcus was hurt. He needed urgent medical care, or the issue could escalate. When the emergency services arrived, Marcus had to be taken to the hospital. Throughout his hospital stay, Vivien sat by his bedside, displaying unwavering loyalty. If Marcus could take a knife for her, it meant he would do anything for her. The doctors bandaged his wounds and took care of him until he recovered. When he was discharged, Vivien asked him to rest at his home for a few days before resuming work, but Marcus wouldn't listen. He couldn't afford to leave her by herself. What if something even worse happened to her? Marcus resumed work and continued taking care of Vivien. They had many conversations, and Vivien learned about Marcus's mother. Marcus's father had passed away, and he had just a mom and a little sister who lived in another city. His mother had been diagnosed with leukemia and needed a bone marrow transplant. They had been saving money for it, but it wasn't enough. When Vivien heard this, she assured him that everything would be fine. He was young, and he had a promising future, so he shouldn't be worried. In the following month, Vivien's health deteriorated to the point that she wasn't even responding to medications anymore. Marcus called the ambulance, and Vivien was admitted to the hospital. The doctors tried all they could, but her cells kept dying. Even when the doctors saw the case as hopeless, Marcus didn't. He was a staunch believer in miracles. He couldn't afford to lose Vivien, as they had built an unbreakable bond. He begged her to fight for her life and kept holding her hands, urging her to stay strong. As Vivien lay on the hospital bed, too weak to move her body, she reflected on her life with deep gratitude. Marcus was one of the best people to exist in her life in recent years. She was glad that the universe gave her this gift during her last moments. As dusk approached, she again told Marcus to go home, but he refused. Vivien wanted him to return to his own mother, but Marcus did not budge. His mom would be fine, but he needed to keep watch on her. Marcus stayed with her all night, listening to her voice, which by now was barely above a whisper. She kept thanking Marcus for everything until she fell silent a few hours before dawn. At that same time, the monitor stopped beeping. Marcus screamed as he didn't want to believe what was happening. When the doctor stepped in, he begged him to resuscitate Vivien, but the doctor merely confirmed her passing at 4:20. While her body was prepared for burial, Marcus couldn't believe what had happened. He fell into a bout of shock and remained still for a few moments. His benefactor had died. Worse, his friend had died. He had come to love Vivien so much that her passing hit him like a ton of bricks. She was like the grandmother he never had. His heartbeat increased, and he almost had a heart failure. Tears started flowing from his eyes as he trembled in grief. He cried so hard that his eyes were sore and his voice was lost. He returned home and couldn't sleep. He kept wishing life wasn't so cruel. It was very hard to move on, but he had to. He spent over 3 days indoors, and his mom, who heard the news, came to see him to comfort her son. A week later, Vivien was buried in a cemetery. Marcus stared at the tombstone for the last time. "You will always be in my heart," Marcus said softly. He returned home and made plans to find a new job. A few weeks later, he heard a knock on his door. 3 men were standing outside his house, clad in expensive suits. Marcus was confused and slightly wary. One of them stepped forward and introduced himself as Vivien's attorney. He then said the most shocking thing that Marcus had ever heard. Vivien had willed all her estates and business investments to Marcus. Marcus was in deep shock and waved it off as a joke. The attorney handed a document to him, and Marcus went through the pages. As he did, his mouth hung open in shock. Vivien was a millionaire with shares in top companies. She had single-handedly grown her business to wealth back when she was just 30 years old. She was very wealthy, and she started buying estates. She channeled all her energy into business, and she never got married. When she was 40, she started up a foundation for kids and also had a few charity homes on her payroll. A few weeks ago, after Marcus saved her life from the intruder, she informed her attorney to pass her wealth down to Marcus when she died. Marcus was now a millionaire. Marcus was touched and honored to be blessed by Vivien just because he took care of her well. Now that Marcus was a millionaire, he could afford his mom's surgery. Marcus truly wouldn't have received such a massive reward if he hadn't offered his seat some months ago. His kindness and compassion had earned him a lifetime of riches. Have you ever given up your seat for someone in need? Share your stories in the comments. We hope you enjoyed the story. Turn on your notification button to enjoy more videos.